People have tested positive. Another 50 COVID patients have passed away in the past day, only 8 of whom had received at least one jab. Officials said a 9-year-old boy who was chronically ill passed away after he was found unconscious at home. The child tested positive for COVID when he was sent to United Christian Hospital. A chief manager of the hospital authority, Lau Ka-hin, says the cause of death is unclear.
The parents told us that the patient has some tiredness, malaise, and decrease in appetite, but there was no other upper respiratory tract infection symptoms, no fever, no convulsion, and the patient was not tested any COVID before the admission. Due to the very short period of death time between the patients at home and in the emergency department, the patient was referred to the coroner for further investigation.
Health authorities have locked down several buildings in Cheung-Sha-Wan, Cheung-Kwan-O and Kwun Tong for mass COVID testing. In a statement, they said Ming Tai House at the An Tai Estate and Royal Diamond Towers 5A and 5B of the Wings 2 have been sealed off, with authorities expecting the operation to be completed by midday. Lai Pak House at Lai Tsui Court has also been sealed until 1 p.m. The news from RTHK.
Good morning and welcome to RTHK's Hong Kong Today. I'm Janice Wong.
And I'm Vicky Wong. Coming up, Russia launches a large-scale military assault on Ukraine. In Hong Kong, a 9-year-old boy infected with COVID-19 dies. Oil prices soar to above $100 a barrel for the first time in 7 years as news of the Russian attack spreads. And Arsenal score a late winner to beat Wolves 2-1 in the English Premier League.
Russia has attacked Ukraine by land, air and sea. Russian military vehicles have entered the country from many directions, and cruise and ballistic missiles have struck military headquarters and airports. Ukrainian forces have launched a counterattack against Russian airborne troops who took control of an airfield just 15 kilometers from the center of Kyiv. President Putin has threatened that any interference will lead to an immediate response never previously experienced in history. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has condemned Russia's attack as treacherous, likening it to the invasion by Nazi German forces in the Second World War.
What do we hear today? It's not just rocket explosions, fighting, the roar of aircraft. It's the sound of a new Iron Curtain lowering and closing Russia away from the civilized world. Our national task is for that curtain not to fall on Ukrainian territory, but on the homes of Russians.
In the Ukrainian capital Kyiv, there was shock, fear and for some, panic. People sheltered underground or formed long queues at banks and supermarkets. There was gridlock on the highways as people tried to leave. At Kyiv's bus station, young people looked at any way to escape.
I'm going to my parents. They are living in the middle of Ukraine, and I think it's safer there. Everyone said that at 4 a.m. it's going to start a war, but it was nothing, and I going to sleep, and then my mother called me and said that war is started.
We're going to Cherkasy, to our family, to be together now in this not very safe time in Ukraine, but we will have a victory.
China has called for restraint on all sides while saying the military operation should not be described as an invasion. At a regular press briefing in Beijing, Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying called for cool heads to prevail.
China is closely watching the latest situation, and we call on all parties to maintain restraint and prevent the situation from getting out of control. We have repeatedly stated China's position on the Ukraine issue. This issue has complex historical background and reasons. The result we are seeing today is an interplay of all kinds of factors.
The Chinese embassy in Ukraine has warned citizens there to be alert for severe disturbances and to stay home as much as possible.
Speaking in Brussels, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said President Putin should not underestimate the strength of the European Union and condemned him for bringing war back to Europe.
The world can see that unity is our strength. Early this morning, President Putin ordered atrocious acts of aggression against a sovereign and independent country and innocent people. We will hold Russia accountable for this outrageous violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and the territorial integrity. And what is at stake is not just Donbass, it's not just Ukraine. What is at stake is the stability of Europe and the whole international order, our peace order.
The French President Emmanuel Macron said he deplored what he called the invasion and expressed solidarity with Ukraine.
Dans cette épreuve, la France se tient aux côtés de l'Ukraine. Je veux saluer le courage.
In this ordeal, France stands alongside Ukraine. I want to salute the courage and determination of the Ukrainian president, of the authorities and the Ukrainian people. Their freedom is ours. By breaking his word, by refusing the diplomatic path, by choosing war, President Putin has not only attacked Ukraine, he has decided to flout the sovereignty of Ukraine and to cause the most serious attack on the peace and stability of Europe for decades.
The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced further sanctions on more than 100 Russian individuals and entities. Speaking in the House of Commons, Mr. Johnson said the world now saw Mr. Putin for what he was, a blood-stained aggressor who believed in imperial conquest.
Earlier today, President Putin delivered another televised address and offered the absurd pretext that he sought the demilitarization and de-Nazification of Ukraine. In fact, he is hurling the might of his military machine against a free and peaceful neighbour in breach of his own explicit pledge and every principle of civilized behaviour between states, spurning the best efforts of this country and our allies to avoid bloodshed. For this, Putin will stand condemned in the eyes of the world and of history. He will never be able to cleanse the blood of Ukraine from his hands.
President Biden announced further sanctions on Russia, which he said went further than anything that had ever been done. In a televised address, Mr. Biden said there would be stringent new limits on what could be exported to Russia, with G7 countries stopping Russian businesses from conducting trade in major foreign currencies. He said Russia would pay a heavy price for Mr. Putin's actions.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war. And now he and his country will bear the consequences. Today, I'm authorizing additional strong sanctions and new limitations on what can be exported to Russia. This is going to impose severe cost on the Russian economy, both immediately and over time. We have purposely designed these sanctions to maximize the long-term impact on Russia and to minimize the impact on the United States and our allies. And I want to be clear. The United States is not doing this alone. For months, we've been building a coalition of partners representing well more than half the global economy.
For more on the Ukraine crisis, we're now joined on the line by Paul Rogers, Professor of Peace Studies at the University of Bradford in the UK. Hello, Professor Rogers. Thanks for joining us on the program.
Good morning.
So the scale of the Russian military assault, is it surprising?
It is pretty intense, probably more so than many people expected. Essentially, the main operations today have been to try and ensure the Russian security of Ukrainian airspace by attacking the anti-aircraft missiles, the airfield, the communication centres and headquarters. But it goes farther than that. There have been pretty extensive attacks on weapons dumps of many different sorts. There's been essentially an attempt to prevent the Ukraine Navy, which is not very large, from leaving port. And there have been some actual airdrops of troops, although not on a huge scale yet. It is early days, but I think it is clear that Russia intends to be able to occupy these parts of the country. Indeed, that is already happening in the eastern Donbass part of Ukraine, where the area which was previously under the control of Russian dissidents is essentially now receiving Russian troops and extending beyond the original area of control. So it's a major operation, which I think is still in its relatively early days.
And how do you see this conflict developing from here? Is a full-scale occupation likely?
It's beginning to look as though Putin wants some way to be able to take full control of Ukraine. Probably trying to avoid a complete occupation, because that would lead to real vulnerabilities for his troops on the ground. But certainly he wants Ukraine to be a pure client state of Russia, rather like in many ways Belarus already is. And Putin has made it absolutely clear that if NATO opposes this by the use of force, in other words, if we end up with military force from NATO being used against Russian forces, then that could be escalated alarmingly. The reality is that the Russian conventional military are strong, but they are no match for the combined strength of NATO. And the risk, and it's a small but very significant risk, is that if NATO did let that happen and engage directly in warfare, then Russia might then consider escalating to the use of small tactical nuclear weapons. The United States is well aware of this, which means that the route being taken of severe sanctions is the chosen route for the present time. The effect of that, though, is too early to say, and of course there will be an effect on the global economy just by developing these kinds of sanctions.
So from what we're seeing right now, what do you think will be Russia's next move? I mean, we've seen targeted surgical airstrikes. Will we be seeing more of this kind of attack? I mean, just like what Russia did to Georgia back in 2008?
Yes, but it was very different then, because the Russian Air Force was lamentably ill-equipped. It ended up having to use test pilots and pilot instructors to fly the planes, because the ordinary pilots just didn't have the flying hours. It is rather more advanced now. What will be happening now in the Russian ministries will be extensive bomb damage assessment to see what they've achieved and what they still need to do. And there may be many more airstrikes in the next 2 or 3 days. What we do not know is the extent to which Russia will actually try to take over the regime in some form. It is difficult to see how Putin can achieve his stated aim of really demilitarizing Ukraine unless he does that. But that will be a major operation which will take quite a long time unless the Ukraine government just collapses. The worry in the longer term from a Western perspective is that with Ukraine and Belarus essentially under control of Moscow, that will mean that there'll be almost a kind of new Iron Curtain, if you like, coming down. And it may even be that Putin would decide to forward base tactical nuclear weapons in those two territories. Remember that by pure coincidence, although it was nothing of the sort, Russia did actually hold nuclear drills, including test firings of nuclear-capable missiles, with Belarus only a few days ago.
And earlier, U.S. President Joe Biden said the United States and its allies will respond in a united and decisive way. Do you see any U.S. or any other Western powers stepping in militarily in this case? I mean, you did mention NATO. What are the chances of them stepping in?
I think it is very unlikely. NATO is fully aware that if it was actually to step in, there could be a huge escalation in the conflict. So that is unlikely. But in these sorts of fractious times, there is always the risk of an accident being misinterpreted, or an incident, or even a maverick trying to push things along. That is one of the very big dangers at the present time, particularly because both the Russian separatists and some of the Ukraine militias operate almost on their own outside the scope of the leaderships on the two sides. So that's a major danger to consider. It's an added reason why NATO members are not going to try and get involved in this directly, but it does mean that there'll be far more emphasis on sanctions and other moves.
And you mentioned sanctions. New sanctions have been imposed on Russia by the West. How much of an impact will this actually have on Russia?
I think the reality, and as I said, I think it's pretty well known among the Western states, is that sanctions can have an effect, but in this case only in the long term. Russia's been pretty careful in building up plenty of foreign exchange reserves. Certainly it's hugely dependent in its economy for the export of oil and gas. I mean, it cannot really survive without that. But the issue is that if the oil and gas exports to Europe are in some way interrupted, then there are other customers. China obviously is a very important one. There are others in the Middle East and possibly India as well. So it will take a long time for sanctions to have an effect, perhaps many months. And in that time, Russia may be able to complete what it wants to do and then even sort of quasi-negotiate its way out of it. So the odds are actually with Russia at the present time, but the risk of escalation is always there, and it's really serious. And in the long term, I think there's no doubt that this will do huge damage to the status of Putin in the wider world community, which is the direct opposite of what he wants to achieve personally.
And does China have any role to play in de-escalating this conflict?
China has potentially a very big role because it is a very close trading partner with Russia, and it has a lot of influence with Putin. And you saw that recently with the major summit meeting. And you see, for example, the recent tripartite drills in the Arabian Sea between China, Russia, and Iran. So China, in fact, has a great deal of influence, probably more than any other country at the present time. Whether it will choose to use it in a way which brings this conflict to an early end is a very different matter. But it certainly has more potential to influence Putin than any other country just now.
And this conflict won't just affect Russia and Ukraine, it will affect the whole world. I mean, what impact will it have on the current balance of power, and what economic impact will it have?
It's going to, in terms of the balance of power, it will depend very much on how this ends. In terms of economic impact, it will probably be considerable. You have to go back, I would think, to the huge sudden increase in oil prices in 1973-74, and that led on to huge economic upheavals around the world in the mid and late 1970s. And that gives you some idea of what can happen when, in a more or less unregulated market, you have countries and investors seeking to maximize the profitability of their exports. That is likely to happen now. So I think the impact on the world economy, which is already in somewhat of a fragile state, could really be huge.
All right, Professor Rogers, I'm sure we can continue discussing this for another hour, but unfortunately we're out of time. Thanks again for joining us this morning. And that's Paul Rogers, Professor of Peace Studies at the University of Bradford in the UK.
It's now 11 minutes to 7 on Hong Kong Today. Turning now to the coronavirus situation in Hong Kong. A 9-year-old boy who was infected with COVID-19 has died. That's in addition to the 50 other deaths reported by health authorities yesterday. Officials also announced they were using Tin Shui Wai Hospital to treat COVID patients. Frank Yong reports.
Health authorities have been notified of 17,269 new COVID cases. The new notification figure adds up all the cases that the Centre for Health Protection has been informed about over the past 24 hours from both public and private laboratories and covers both preliminary positive and confirmed cases. And there were 8,798 confirmed infections. Authorities also reported 50 deaths over the past day, with the ages of patients ranging between 52 and 97. In addition, a 9-year-old chronically ill boy who was infected with COVID died yesterday morning. He had been found unconscious before he was admitted to United Christian Hospital and passed away soon afterwards. A chief manager of the hospital authority, Lau Kah-hin, said the cause of death is unclear.
The parents told us that patient has some tiredness, malaise, and decrease in appetite last line, but there was no other upper respiratory tract infection symptoms, no fever, no convulsion, and the patient was not tested any COVID before the admission. Due to the very short period of death time between the patients at home and in the emergency department, the patient was referred to the coroner for further investigation.
And with the number of infections continuing to rise, Dr. Lau said all 300 beds at Tin Shui Wai Hospital will be used to treat COVID-19 patients from Saturday. Current patients will be transferred to other hospitals, but the accident and emergency department there will continue to operate. Officials urge patients who are suffering only mild symptoms not to seek treatment at A&E units, saying hospitals are inundated. They also called on people to make good use of the 9 designated COVID-19 clinics across Hong Kong.
Frank Yung reporting. Health authorities have recently begun using a new set of figures that they say paints a more accurate picture of the day-to-day COVID situation. The so-called notification figures add up all the cases that the Centre for Health Protection has been informed about over the previous 24 hours from both public and private laboratories and covers both preliminary positive and confirmed cases. They believe the previous preliminary positive figures was no longer accurate because of a backlog in cases. Infectious disease expert Leung Chi-Chu says it's an improvement, but it could be more useful looking at specimens submitted.
Confirmed data simply may not be accurate, and the number of cases have been preliminarily reported by the laboratory within 24 hours, should have been a better index. Unfortunately, we have a very long delay in the turnover for the laboratory testing. Some of these positive specimens could have been submitted over a week ago. So out of the 17,000 positive reports in the last 24 hours, we really don't know when were the specimens submitted. And without that information, it's very difficult to have clear grasp of the actual disease trend.
Turning over to some business and finance news, stocks in Russia plummeted following the country's attack on Ukraine, forcing the temporary suspension of the Moscow exchange. Russia's currency, the ruble, also hit record lows against the dollar. Oil prices have soared to above $100 a barrel for the first time in 7 years. As news of the Russian attack spread, investors flocked to traditionally safe assets, leading to a rise in the price of gold. On Wall Street, after opening sharply lower, the three major indices ended up in positive territory. The S&P finished up 1.5% at 4,288. The Nasdaq climbed 3.3% to close at 13,473. And the Dow gained 0.3% to end at 33,223. Tech stocks were among the big gainers as traders hunted for deals, with Netflix climbing 6.1% by the close, Microsoft winning 5.1%, and Meta Platforms, formerly Facebook, gaining 4.6%. Hong Kong Exchanges and Clearing has posted a 9% rise in annual net profit to a record $12.5 billion. Average daily turnover on the stock exchange jumped 29% to $167 billion. Revenue and other income was up 9% on the year to another historic high of $21 billion, boosted by trading and clearing fees from the record headline average daily turnover. The bourse operator has declared a second interim dividend of $4.18 per share. We'll have the sports next.
Our hands often touch public items covered with viruses and bacteria. When we touch our eyes, nose or mouth, the pathogens can enter the body. Health is in our hands. To prevent infection, follow the 7 hand cleaning steps. Rub hands for 20 seconds. Rinse thoroughly. Dry with a clean cloth or paper towel. If you can't wash your hands and they aren't visibly soiled, use an alcohol-based hand rub. What if our hands get dirty again? Clean them properly.
Good morning, I'm Adam Chung with sports. Let's start with football. Arsenal boosted their bid to finish in the English Premier League's top 4 after completing a late comeback against Wolves. The Gunners fell behind to Hwan Hee-chan's early goal at the Emirates Stadium, and they waited till the final minutes of the game to seal a 2-1 win. Nicolas Pepe came off the bench to equalize for Arsenal in the 82nd minute. Then in the final seconds, Wolves keeper Jose Sa deflected a shot by Alexander Lacazette into his own net. Arsenal's third successive league victory moved them up to 5th in the table. They're just 1 point behind 4th place Manchester United and have 2 games in hand in the race to qualify for the Champions League. We'll have more football later on the program. Now we turn to the ice. The NHL leading Colorado Avalanche brushed aside the Detroit Red Wings 5-2 to go 12 points clear above everyone else in the Western Conference. Also in the West, the Calgary Flames ride a 10-game winning streak into Vancouver. Let's get the latest now from Ray Jovanovich, our U.S. sports commentator who's joined us on the line. Ray, good morning.
A good Friday morning to you, Adam. The NHL has now played 50 games in the 82-game regular season. We're hoping that it's a full season. A lot of games have been canceled, postponed because of COVID. The good news is that The NHL All-Star Game is behind us now. The NHL decided also not to send any players to the Olympics, which gave the players another break, I think, which was a good idea. And as you just mentioned, the Colorado Avalanche are the NHL's best team by far, 78 points. They've got a goal differential of 59. They've scored over 200 goals this season. The other team that's done virtually the same has been the team leading the Eastern Conference, the Florida Panthers. They've got 212 goals, and they've got a goal differential of 61. Both these two teams really showing why they're the top in the NHL. But as you mentioned, the Calgary Flames have been on fire. They've come out of nowhere to win those 10 consecutive games to get the first place in the Pacific Division. Finally, a couple of things about two other teams in Canada. The Montreal Canadiens, who last year went to the Stanley Cup Finals, losing to the eventual champions, the Tampa Bay Lightning, who won the NHL Stanley Cup for the second consecutive season. The Canadiens, can you believe it, are the worst team in the NHL. It's really remarkable what's happened. And the Toronto Maple Leafs, hanging around, they're right at the top of the Eastern Conference as well. Could the Maple Leafs, could this be the year, the first in 18 years since the Maple Leafs have won a first-round playoff series?
Yeah, I mean, Leaf fans are waiting to see that the Leafs can prove to us that they can win the first round in the playoffs. I want to talk to you a little more about the Florida Panthers, though. You mentioned they topped the Atlantic Division. Do you think they can hold on to win that division and finish ahead of Tampa Bay and Toronto?
You know, this team has had some controversy this year. Their head coach, former Chicago Blackhawk, three-time Stanley Cup champion coach Joe Quenneville, stepped down during the season around December, I believe it was. But the Panthers have just gone from strength to strength. As I mentioned, they've scored 212 goals, one of only two teams over 200, provided they stay healthy. And that's one of the reasons, for example, why the Las Vegas Golden Knights have not been playing well. A lot of injuries have affected that team. So the Panthers obviously need that health to stay positive, because the Tampa Bay Lightning, defending Cup champions, right behind them, just a couple of points trailing.
Yeah, it should be an exciting race. Ray, thank you so much for the update, and enjoy the games this weekend. That was Ray Jovanovich, our U.S. sports commentator. Before I go, let's get to a little more football now. In the Europa League, Barcelona cruised into the last 16 after a comfortable 4-2 win over Napoli. Barca go through 5-3 on aggregate. The Catalans who were on top almost from the start, with Jordi Alba opening scoring off a counter-attack. Then a long-range effort by Frankie de Jong effectively put that game away. That's all the sports for now. We'll have more in 25 minutes.
Thanks, Adam. Now, the weather forecast for today: cold in the morning, mainly fine later, with a top temperature of around 18 degrees. The very cold weather warning is currently in force. Right now, the temperature is 13 degrees, relative humidity 79%.
RTHK News.
It's 7 o'clock. I'm Andrew Shirovsky. President Biden is to impose sanctions on a key Baltic gas pipeline, Nordstream 2, as he toughens measures against Russia over its stance on Ukraine. The sanctions will target the company and its corporate officers. It follows a decision on Tuesday by Germany to suspend the certification process for the recently completed pipeline. A State Department spokesman, Ned Price, praised the unity of NATO countries.
What the Germans did was to ensure that the pipeline is no longer part of the equation. Right. So by acting together with the Germans, how we did, when we did, and the way in which we did, we have ensured that this is an $11 billion prize investment that is now a hunk of steel sitting at the bottom of the sea.
Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has made a plea for swift international action to avert a war in Ukraine, saying the impact of a Russian invasion would be felt globally. Addressing the United Nations General Assembly, Mr. Kuleba said a large-scale conflict would be the end of the world order as we know it. Speaking to reporters, Mr. Kuleba said the West's current sanctions would not stop Russia.
This is not enough, and our partners should not wait for Russian rockets to hit Ukrainian soil or Russian planes to cross into our airspace to impose the new wave of sanctions. Sanctions make sense when they deter Russia from further action. So the time for the next wave of sanctions has come. We are in a very dynamic situation, and every day matters.
In local news, health authorities have been notified of 17,269 new COVID infections, which includes all the cases collected from public and private labs in the past day and covers both preliminary positive and confirmed cases. They also confirmed that 8,798 people have tested positive. Another 50 COVID patients have passed away in the past day, only 8 of whom had received at least one jab. Officials said a 9-year-old boy who was chronically ill passed away after he was found unconscious at home. The child tested positive for COVID when he was sent to the United Christian Hospital. The chief manager of the hospital authority, Lau Ka-hin, said the cause of death was unclear.
The parents told us that patient has some tiredness, malaise, and decrease in appetite, but there was no other upper respiratory tract infection symptoms, no fever, no convulsion, and the patient was not tested any COVID before the admission. Due to the very short period of death time between the patients at home and in the emergency department, the patient was referred to the coroner for further investigation.
You're listening to the news on RTHK.
Thanks to Andrew Sharofsky in our newsroom. This is Hong Kong Today with Janice Wong and me, Vicky Wong. Coming up in the next half hour, we hear from the restaurant trade, which says the new vaccine pass system has seen business drop by up to 20%.
It would take them more time, for example, 2 or 3 minutes. They have to find the location of the apps in their smartphone. Some other elderly did not have their phone with them, so they have to produce the vaccine certificate.
Ukrainian citizens seek safety from an intense Russian military assault, and private home prices fall for the 4th month in a row.
But first, health authorities confirmed over 8,700 new coronavirus cases yesterday. Authorities also said in the previous 24-hour period, they were notified of over 17,000 cases from public and private laboratories. Meanwhile, another 50 patients died, including a chronically ill 9-year-old boy. Only 8 of those who died had received at least one COVID-19 jab. A chief manager of the hospital authority, Lau Ka-hin, said the boy was found unconscious at home and tested positive when he was sent to United Christian Hospital. He said the cause of death was unclear.
The parents told us that patient has some tiredness, malaise, and decrease in appetite last night, but there was no other upper respiratory tract infection symptoms, no fever, no convulsion, and the patient was not tested any COVID before the admission. Due to the very short period of death time between the patients at home and in the emergency department, the patient was referred to the coroner for further investigation.
Infectious disease expert Leung Chi-chiu says unless the government can address delays in testing and send people who are infected into isolation in a timely manner, it would be difficult to reverse the upward trend in cases in this 5th wave.
I think it's not the problem of the social distancing measure. It's more because we fail to detect the case early, and we also fail to isolate the detected cases. And that is, in fact, paralyzing our conventional control measures. And that is the reason why we have not been able to reverse exponential increase in the cases in the past month.
And now the government has asked the people to wear a face mask when they're exercising outdoor and also in country park. Do you think that will help the situation?
That will contribute a little bit. And in fact, it's more, I think, to allow effective law enforcement, because without such a revision, the exemption may cause a lot of problems when you really want to implement the law or even prosecute those who fail to abide by the law. Because we also a lot of disputes whether one may be exercising when one does not wear the mask outdoor.
There are some people who have complained that the government perhaps should consider reopening salons so that people can get their haircut.
It is a difficult situation because we are still seeing an exponential increase in the number of cases, and our hospitals are also overwhelmed. And at this stage, I think there is little option for the government to relax the social distance measure unless we can improve the delay in the testing, and also unless we can isolate or detect the case promptly, we may not be able to see any reversal of the trend. And without the reversal of trend, I think it is not good situation, and the government may not be in any position to relax all these social distancing measures.
Dr. Leung Chi-Chu there speaking to Timmy Sung. People have begun showing proof of inoculation to enter restaurants after the government's vaccine pass scheme came into effect. Restaurants are now equipped with scanning devices to check customer vaccination records before diners are allowed in. Joanne Wong reports.
The vaccination pass scheme also covers other places, such as supermarkets and shopping malls, which have put QR codes at all entrances for visitors to scan with their Leave Home Safe app. Some people RTHK spoke to said they had no problem abiding by the new requirement. I don't want to get caught, one man said. But this woman said she found the new rules confusing. The terms are ambiguous. Do we need to use Leave Home Safe when we come to buy takeaways or just a few things? The government said people entering malls who intend to shop for anything other than takeaway meals and supermarkets now have to use Leave Home Safe, but they can also be required to produce their vaccination records by the police. Stricter social distancing curbs have also come into effect, with joggers, hikers and other exercising outdoors now required to wear a mask.
Joanne Wong reporting there. Simon Wong, who heads the Federation of Restaurants, say the vaccine pass requirement has led to a 10 to 20% drop in business. He spoke to Natalie Ching.
I went into a restaurant for lunch myself. This Chinese restaurant normally hosts about 250 customers. And I witnessed that during my stay in the restaurant, there are only about 22 customers inside the restaurant, including me.
So as the vaccine pass scheme has come into force yesterday, is it running smooth in restaurants?
Well, overall speaking, the operation for using the vaccine pass is quite smooth. Some restaurants even have some people in front of the restaurant and help the customers to use the vaccine pass by the apps. Some senior citizens and some people who are not used to use their own devices, they might not be able to get the vaccine pass message from their telephone. So some people in the restaurant is willing to help those people who doesn't know how to use the phone to retrieve the vaccine pass information.
You mean they help the customers to put the vaccine pass into their Leave Home Safe app?
Yes.
Okay. But how long does it take for a customer to enter the restaurants usually?
On average, I noticed that there might be some delay for some special customers. For example, some elderly, it would take them more time, for example, 2 or 3 minutes. They have to find the location of the apps in their smartphone. Some other elderly did not have their phone with them, so they have to produce the vaccine certificate. Then it would take a little time to go over all these issues.
Are there any ways to speed up the process of scanning customers' vaccine records?
I don't know if there's any better way, because this is designed by the government. We have to use their apps. The thing is, I always criticize on these apps because we have to save the information of the customers for 31 days. This is actually not necessary if the customers or people using the Leave Home Safe app has an actual recognition of their identity.
Meanwhile, the government plans to introduce a moratorium for Sme Rents. Given that the social distancing rules won't be eased soon, is this measure helpful at all?
For the SMEs, particularly for the restaurant operators, They are now facing a very, very difficult time. If there's this kind of arrangement, it would help them to go over the difficult situation. Then I think we have to do it, and we welcome the idea. But having said that, we are still quite worried about what happened after 6 months or 3 months, because they still have to pay the rent for the months they did not pay. So this might still create some kind of concern, and especially for the landlords. If they don't get the rent from the tenant, how can they survive? This is kind of a chicken and egg game.
Do you think it could bring more problems perhaps on rental management?
Of course, it might create some kind of problem between landlord and the tenant. But we are hoping that there will be some kind of negotiations or compromise between the two parties, especially during this difficult time when the tenants are not able to pay rent. They might just choose to close the business. Then in this case, the landlord will not get any payment for the rent. So we would rather urge the tenant as well as the landlord to talk to each other and try to negotiate some terms.
Simon Wong from the Federation of Restaurants speaking there to Natalie Ching. More now on the situation in Ukraine. The Russian and Ukrainian armies are fighting fierce battles in several places close to Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, as Moscow's multi-pronged invasion progresses. Ukrainian forces have launched a counterattack against Russian airborne troops who took control of the airfield just 15 kilometers from the center of Kyiv. Not far to the north, Russian forces who entered from Belarus have been fighting the Ukrainians near the former nuclear power plant at Chernobyl. There's also been heavy fighting in the east, right along the front line with the separatist areas of Donetsk and Luhansk. Numerous casualties have been reported. Earlier, Vladimir Putin told a televised meeting of business leaders there was no other way for him to defend Russia other than to invade Ukraine. Vitaly Milanov is an MP from the governing United Russian Party. He blames Europe and Washington for trying to turn Ukraine into an aggressive country that pushes against Russia.
For many years, you've been trying to use this poor territory with a weak state as anti-Russian force. And now it's a small payback time. It's like a reasonable reaction towards the aggression. So-called Ukrainian military forces, these people been used by you, Europeans. You did it. We felt ourselves quite comfortable with Ukraine as a sovereign state, being a peaceful neighbor of Russian Federation for many years. Right after your best started to make politics there from the so-called revolution in Ukraine, right after your unsuccessful attempt to make your puppy state in 2014, they became a country with a very aggressive position. You use this country for your own personal political needs to act against Russia. Haven't you foreseen this situation, that if you're trying to push Russian bear for 8 years, sometimes it can happen vice versa?
Sviatoslav Jurash is a member of Ukraine's ruling party. He says Russia is trying to annex Ukraine.
Russia wants to take Ukraine, not just regime change. Putin is very clear that he wants to consume Ukraine whole. He has made an hour-long speech just to that effect, and his policies over the years and his statements over the years is very much in that regard. So the point here is not to be forgotten that Putin wants to destroy the biggest state in Europe, annex it in different ways, but still annex it. I today went to the recruiting stations in Kyiv, and they are full. There are huge queues of people getting ready for battle, and there are people that essentially are staying and fighting for our capital. I am staying as well. I was a part today of the effort to get weapons into the hands of those who want to try and defend Ukraine in the capital in any way possible. I now am at home because of the curfew and with my AK-47, and although I'm not much of a soldier, I will do everything possible to try and defend our capital.
President Biden has announced further sanctions on Russia, which he said went further than anything that had ever been done and would impose severe costs. In a televised address, he said Vladimir Putin had launched an assault on the very principles that upheld global peace in an attempt to re-establish the Soviet Union. Jim Costa is a Democratic congressman who sits on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and is co-chair of the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue. He responds to criticisms that President Biden's sanctions and threat of action was too little too late.
I think we've made it very clear in terms of the strategy that the president, together with our NATO allies, is employed and worked very hard on for months to pressure Putin. I don't think anyone watching the pariah Putin and his desires to recreate the old empire of the Soviet Union believed that sanctions alone would do the job. But I think the fact is that he was counting on two things. One, the disunity of NATO, and two, that there would be no fight in Ukraine or little resistance. I think on those two scores, he's wrong. I just came back from a NATO Parliamentary Assembly meeting in Brussels earlier this week. And over the years that I participated, the unity of the 30 countries in NATO is stronger than I've ever seen it. And clearly we see Ukraine in the first 24 hours fighting on multiple fronts. This is going to take time. It's going to take months. And who knows? Russia may find themselves creating the same quagmire for them.
Ukrainian citizens have been leaving their homes seeking safety in other parts of the country and in neighbouring nations. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees estimated that more than 100,000 people had already left their homes, with a few thousand crossing into Moldova and Romania. Poland is setting up reception points for refugees. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said he was allocating $20 million to fund urgent humanitarian needs as it scales up operations in and around Ukraine. Valentina Butchenko is a 19-year-old student at King's College London. She went back to her home city of Kyiv 3 weeks ago.
I think it would be good here to give some context. Yesterday, I was walking through the Maidan, and the Maidan Square, which is, in the center of Kyiv, and it was beautiful weather. I had coffee with one of my really close friends. I was living a kind of very basic everyday life in my home city. And this morning, I woke up to the sound of an explosion. I've been in my house all day locked up. We've had to tape up our windows to ensure that if an explosion happens nearby, that glass doesn't fly everywhere. I've had to go into the city a few times to pick up, some friends who had been near explosions and were in serious danger, or who were really fearing they had nowhere to hide. They had no bunkers close by to them because air signs were going off. So I now have some people staying in my house. And my city is essentially in martial law and complete lockdown. There is no such thing as inevitability. I truly, firmly believe that, yes, Putin has an enormous army, and yes, he has incredibly powerful weaponry, but Ukraine has been hardened by war since 2014. Ukraine has been defending its land since 2014. And you know what? Well, prior to 2014, there is something Ukraine has that Russia doesn't. And what that is, it's unity and patriotism. And we care. We very, very firmly care. And we will do anything for our country. Every single person in this country, including me, is entirely committed to protecting it.
Extreme wildfires are set to become more frequent, increasing by around 50% by the end of the century. That's according to a report by the UN Environment Programme. The new study calls for a radical reallocation of financial resources from fighting fires to prevention. Tim Christofferson coordinates the work on forests and climate change at the UNEP.
Climate change. There are some other contributing factors, for example, for forest, planting the wrong trees in the wrong place, eucalypts in southern Europe, for example, that are very fire prone. So forest management is partly to blame, but it's first and foremost climate change that is driving this increase. And what's important is that even under a low emissions scenario, so even if we manage to curb emissions, wildfires will still increase because of the lag time in natural systems. So we have to get better prepared. There have always been fires all across human history, but the wildfires we see now, fires that we call mega fires, extreme fires that are extreme in intensity, that are extreme in scope, they are on the increase. So these are not fires that have always occurred, and in some ecosystems are a very important part of rejuvenation of that ecosystems, in savannas, for example, but these are fires that are new in the sense that they affect ecosystems that so far were not so much affected, like wetlands or the Arctic, and that they're much bigger in intensity and scope.
Let's have a look at some business news now. Private home prices have fallen for the fourth month in a row to their lowest level since March. New government indices show that private flat prices in January fell 1.1% month on month, but on year prices were still 1.8% higher. Hannah Zhong, the head of valuation at Colliers Hong Kong, a real estate services company, said flat prices may go down further if the SAR is unable to control the epidemic.
Given the current situation of a slowdown economy as well as the Omicron situation, and if this prolonged till middle of this year, the price will continue to fall and we might ending up negative figure. But at this moment, hopefully, if the current virus situation gets under control by middle of the year, then we will expect some possible movement by second half, that ending up possibly the price increment, slight increment by end of the year, possibly 0 to 3%.
Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba says profit in the October-December period fell 74%, the company's third straight quarterly drop. Hangzhou-based Alibaba Group cited a complex and volatile market environment in announcing net income of $3.2 billion. Alibaba's Hong Kong and US listed shares have lost half their value over the past 12 months due to the company's troubles, headlined by a wide-ranging crackdown on Chinese regulators on alleged anti-competitive practices by Alibaba and other domestic tech giants. Hong Kong exports grew year on year for the 15th straight month, but at a slower pace. Total export value in January jumped 18.4% from a year ago, following a nearly 25% growth in December. January imports rose almost 10%. The government says exports to the mainland, the US, the EU and other major Asian markets all saw visible expansion last month. But it also pointed out that the trade figures may have been distorted by the timing of the Lunar New Year, and there should be a better picture of the situation when February's data becomes available. Rolls-Royce, the British maker of aircraft engines, has announced a return to annual profit. It said net profit for 2021 was $162 million, compared with a loss after tax totaling just under $4.3 billion the year before. That year, it axed thousands of jobs and launched a major divestment program to navigate damaging pandemic fallout across the aviation industry. Rolls also announced that Warren East would leave his role as CEO at the end of the year after 8 years in the job. We'll have sports next.
To prevent the spread of disease, make sure all drainage traps contain water. Pour half a liter of water into each drain outlet every week. Check sinks, baths, toilets, and floor drain outlets regularly. If drainage pipes are leaking or blocked, or drain outlets emit a foul smell, arrange prompt inspection and repair by a qualified person. Don't alter drains and pipes on your own. Visit chp.gov.hk for details.
Time for another look at sports. I'm Adam Chung. Let's start with football. Arsenal boosted their bid to finish in the English Premier League's top four after completing a late comeback against Wolves. The Gunners fell behind to Hwan Hee-chan's early goal at the Emirates and waited till the final minutes of the game to seal a 2-1 win. Nicolas Pepe came off the bench to equalize for the Gunners in the 82nd minute. Then Alexander Lacazette scored in injury time to make it 2-1 for Arsenal. Their third successive league victory moves them up to fifth in the table. They're just 1 point behind fourth place Manchester United and have 2 games in hand in the race to qualify for the Champions League. Mikel Arteta, the Arsenal manager, says a dramatic win like this brings the team together.
It creates such a belief and togetherness and an atmosphere and cohesion with our fans as well, and that's extremely necessary. We really want to create something special here, and without our fans, we're not going to be able to do it. And this team needs that belief. We are a really young squad, and I just say at halftime, we want to be there, third, fourth in the top with those big teams. We have to be able to go out there in the second half and beat them. And that was the spirit right from the beginning at halftime, and they managed to do it.
In the Europa League, Barcelona cruised into the last 16 after a comfortable 4-2 win over Napoli. Barca go through 5-3 on aggregate. Elsewhere, the Spanish side Sevilla are also through to the last 16. They progress with a 3-2 aggregate score despite dropping the second leg 1-0 to Dinamo Zagreb. Real Betis also progressed 3-2 on aggregate after a goalless second leg against Zenit St. Petersburg. Atalanta completed a 5-1 aggregate win over Olympiacos, but Lazio are out. They drew 2-2 with Porto in the second leg. The Portuguese side going through 4-3 on aggregate. Leicester City are into the last 16 of the Europa Conference League. They defeated the Danish side Randers 3-1 to complete a 7-2 aggregate success. Leicester were never in danger in this one as Harvey Barnes opened scoring after just 2 minutes. James Maddison then added 2 more in a 4-minute spell in the second half, and that pretty much put the game away. Now, the German tennis star Alexander Zverev could face a heavy penalty for his behavior at the Mexican Open. Zverev apologized for his behavior after he was thrown out of the tournament for attacking the umpire's chair with his racket at the end of a doubles match. On social media, the world number 3 said he has privately apologized to umpire Alessandro Germani. The BBC's Russell Fuller says Zverev will have to pay for his action.
Event, he will probably issue a further fine, and then it comes down to the ATP's senior vice president for rules and competition, who must decide whether this behaviour constitutes a player major offence. And if he's investigated and found guilty under that code, as Nick Kyrgios was in 2019, then there could be a further heavy fine and also a possible suspension from the tour.
On the ice, the NHL leading Colorado Avalanche brushed aside Detroit 5-2 to go 12 points clear above everyone else in the Western Conference. More from RTHK's Ray Jovanovich.
The Colorado Avalanche are the NHL's best team by far, 78 points. They've got a goal differential of 59. They've scored over 200 goals this season. The other team that's done virtually the same has been the team leading the Eastern Conference, the Florida Panthers. They've got 212 goals, and they've got a goal differential of 61. Both of these two teams really showing why they're the top in the NHL. But as you mentioned, the Calgary Flames have been on fire. They've come out of nowhere to win those 10 consecutive games to get to first place in the Pacific Division.
Meanwhile, the Calgary Flames are in action later today. They're taking on the Vancouver Canucks. And for now, that's all the sports.
Thanks, Adam. Now the weather forecast. Cold in the morning, mainly fine later with highs of around 18 degrees. Winds moderate north to northeasterlies. And the outlook mainly fine with temperatures rising over the weekend. Sunny intervals early to midweek next week. At the moment, the temperature reading at the observatory is 13 degrees. Relative humidity 77%. It's now 7:30 with the news summary. Here's Andrew Shirovsky.
President Biden is to impose sanctions on a key Baltic gas pipeline, Nordstream 2, as he toughens measures against Russia over its stance on Ukraine. The sanctions will target the company and its corporate officers. Earlier, Ukraine called for tougher sanctions to try to deter Russia from further aggression. A State Department spokesman, Ned Price, said in addition to previous sanctions, the U.S. had responded swiftly.
Our German allies yesterday took resolute action to ensure that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, what had been a prized $11 billion investment on the part of the Russian Federation, is suspended indefinitely. And as you have just seen, President Biden today authorized sanctions on Nord Stream 2 AG and its corporate office holders. We have now taken complementary action using our own authorities to ensure that Nord Stream 2 is off the table, just as we said it would be.
European Union countries have adopted a package of sanctions against Russia, agreed by ministers on Tuesday. The BBC's Jessica Parker has more details.
It's taken 2 days, but by EU standards, that isn't seen as a bad effort. Ministers, officials and diplomats have been locked in talks to agree the plans. Most of the package is already known. It includes targeting members of Russia's State Duma. It's also understood that the Defence Minister, Sergei Shoigu, and the well-known Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, will also be among individuals subject to an EU travel ban and asset freeze.
In local news, health authorities have been notified of 17,269 new COVID infections, which includes all the cases collected from public and private labs in the past day and covers both preliminary positive and confirmed cases. They also confirmed that 8,798 people have tested positive. Another 50 COVID patients have died in the past day, only 8 of whom had received at least one jab. Officials said a 9-year-old boy who was chronically ill passed away after he was found unconscious at home. The child tested positive for COVID when he was sent to the United Christian Hospital. A chief manager of the hospital authority, Lau Ka-hin, said the cause of death was unclear.
The parents told us that the patient has some tiredness, malaise, and decrease in appetite, but there was no other upper respiratory tract infection symptoms, no fever, no convulsion, and the patient was not tested any COVID before the admission. Due to the very short period of death time between the patients at home and in the emergency department, the patient was referred to the coroner for further investigation.
From tomorrow, about 300 beds at Tin Shui Wai Hospital will be used solely for the treatment of COVID-19 patients. Other patients currently staying at the hospital will be transferred to other treatment facilities. The Hong Kong Baptist Hospital will also free up a dozen beds to house COVID patients. You're listening to the news on RTHK.
Thanks to Andrew Shirovsky in our newsroom. This is Hong Kong Today with me, Janice Wong, and Vicky Wong. Still to come in the final half hour, we'll talk to a family lawyer who's been advising clients and families about what happens if they need to be sent to a COVID isolation facility. President Biden imposes what he calls the toughest sanctions ever on Moscow.
Putin's actions betray his sinister vision for the future of our world, one where nations take what they want by force. But it is a vision that the United States and freedom-loving nations everywhere will oppose.
And despite the plunge in local stocks, we hear optimism from one investor.
But first, war has returned to Europe. Russia began its offensive against Ukraine with air and missile strikes right across the country. Then came the tanks, ground troops from the north, south, and east. Russian troops have moved at speed but faced resistance. Battles have been taking place just kilometres from Kyiv, where fighter jets and airborne troops have attempted to take control of an airbase that would prove crucial in the battle for the capital. As the soldiers advanced, thousands of Ukrainians attempted to flee major cities. President Biden announced further sanctions on Russia, which he said went further than anything that had ever been done. He said Russia would pay a heavy price for Mr. Putin's actions.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences. Today, I'm authorizing additional strong sanctions and new limitations on what can be exported to Russia. This is going to impose severe cost on the Russian economy, both immediately and over time. We have purposely designed these sanctions to maximize the long-term impact on Russia and to minimize the impact on the United States and our allies. And I want to be clear, the United States is not doing this alone. For months, we've been building a coalition of partners representing well more than half the global economy.
European Union leaders have been meeting at an emergency summit in Brussels. They've drawn up a tougher raft of sanctions aimed at crippling the financial, energy and transport sectors in Russia. The measures will also impose export controls, and some are specifically aimed at President Putin's allies. Sviatoslav Yurat is a member of the ruling Ukrainian party. He explains what Ukraine needs now from the West.
Everything. Nothing is enough, as you can say, because Russia has shown itself to be not just a violator, but a destroyer of any kind of pretense of international world order. So the point here is no sanctions are enough and no kind of support is enough. Ukraine needs everything at the moment, and we very much welcome all the steps that UK has been making and clear statements by the Prime Minister in that regard. And we very much see as disgusting what we see today in the European discussion about, for example, switching Russia off from SWIFT systems, where Germany and a number of other countries have declined to support the motion to shut Russia off from international banking systems, because Russia again has done everything possible, both before this and now, to try and show itself to be a country that doesn't want to be a part of the world community.
The Kremlin insists its offensive will last as long as is necessary. President Putin has described its aims as the demilitarization and de-Nazification of Ukraine. He is said to be preparing for a further address to the Russian people. State media have strongly defended the military action, but there is some opposition to it. AnneMarie Evans earlier spoke to RTHK's Moscow correspondent Fred Weir and started by asking him if war was the outcome he'd been expecting.
No, of course not. And I guess people will be wondering in years to come whether the past 2.5 months was a charade or whether Putin really expected or hoped for diplomatic results from the West. But by Monday night, it was perfectly clear that diplomatic door was slammed shut. And when that happens, really it's only war left on the table. What the Russians are engaged in is what the Americans call a war of regime change. And they're going about it exactly the same way. You know, missile strikes, surgical attacks on infrastructure and command and control, seizing strategic points. And it remains to be seen how far they will go. And I think the goal is to change the political leadership in Kyiv, to destroy the Ukrainian army as a fighting force and then change the government so that the message to Ukrainians is you will remain in the Russian sphere of influence. And the message to the West is you must stop trying to include Ukraine into your sphere of influence. I think they will do the minimum they need to accomplish that. That's a rather sweeping goal. And once wars start, you just never know where they're going to go.
So what's been struck so far? And what sort of missiles have they been using?
Oh, they have all sorts of missiles at their disposal. The explosions we've seen so far are happening in military sites, airfields, military bases. They're not terror bombing civilians, and they're not as yet like besieging cities. So the goal basically is to destroy Ukraine's fighting potential. Probably the Russians can do that. But, you just never know. Wars tend to be a litany of unpleasant surprises. The Americans definitely learned that. You can occupy a country, defeat its army, change its leadership, but can you transform it into what you want? Well, look at the experience of the past 20 years. So I hope the Russians have been taking notes about that too, and their goals in Ukraine are limited, but we just do not know.
Our Moscow correspondent Fred Weir there speaking to AnneMarie Evans. Turning now to Hong Kong's coronavirus situation. Epidemiologist Gabriel Leung says the government should roll out its mandatory universal testing scheme only after the city's Omicron outbreak has reached a peak in the first half of March and when Hong Kong has sufficient isolation facilities. Yesterday, authorities confirmed over 8,700 new cases, as well as saying it was notified of more than 17,000 COVID cases in the past 24 hours. Jimmy Choi reports.
As Hong Kong prepares to carry out 3 rounds of mandatory COVID testing on the entire population next month, the Dean of the University of Hong Kong's Faculty of Medicine said the analysis suggests that the current 5th wave will peak in the first or second week of March before gradually fading out in late April. Gabriel Leung said the best timing for Hong Kong to carry out citywide testing will be when the epidemic is in its natural fade-out stage.
If you then do universal testing and you have sufficient isolation facilities to support it, you could then hasten that fade out than it otherwise would naturally do so. Because if you have sufficient isolation facilities and you then identify rather quickly with 2 or 3 consecutive tests, all of the positive infected people in the community and isolate them so that they do not go on to infect others, then you can hasten that fade out.
Professor Leung, who has been advising the government on the pandemic, also stressed the importance for children to get vaccinated during what he called a window period between now and Easter, before students resume face-to-face classes. He said a high vaccination rate among school children could also help prevent another wave of infections when classes resume, something he said many overseas places have seen.
In many of those countries, when classes resume in school-age children, you see another mini wave as the children recongregate in the school setting. And that is why it is so important between now and the end of April, if the plan is to go ahead with in-person classes then, is to vaccinate as many children as possible.
The expert also said the government should consider lifting the ban on flights from 9 countries, including the United States and the United Kingdom, which has been extended until April the 20th. He said since the risk of imported infections is not any higher than that of local transmission, there's no reason not to allow Hong Kongers stranded abroad to come home.
Jimmy Choi reporting there. As the 5th wave of the pandemic hits Hong Kong, the city is facing some of the toughest social distancing measures to date. To discuss their impact on the people, we now have lawyer Samantha Gershon, a partner with Withers' family team, on the line. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us on the programme. So, Hong Kong's coronavirus response is constantly changing. What have your clients been consulting you about the most?
Well, our clients are really concerned about families being separated if one of them becomes positive. So I'm sure a lot of your listeners may have heard about the situation of the 11-month child whose parents are unable to stay with their child when she was taken into hospital. We've got children with severe special needs, and so parents are terrified that they'll be separated from their children if that situation occurs, and that really scares families right now. And so parents, want to have something in place should something happen to them. So they're coming to us for that. They're asking for deed of guardianship documents, and they just want sort of reassurance, if we can give that families can be kept together.
Now, the hospital authorities, Dr. Lau Kai-hin, actually said in a addressed this issue early in a press conference this week and said that they would try their best to treat parents and children who have tested positive in the same hospital. What is your response to that? Is that an adequate response?
Well, I'm sure they're absolutely overwhelmed at the moment, and that's the problem. Things are changing all the time right now, and I'm sure they're doing the best they can. It's a very difficult situation right now, but it's not helping. It's not giving certainty. So it's just creating so much stress for families at the moment, and the best interest of the child is paramount, and that's the problem.
Now, have you heard any reaction from clients about the government announcing that schools would have an early summer break and that there would be a 3-week mandatory citywide testing scheme?
Well, they're worried, they're scared. I mean, from a family lawyer point of view, it's going to cause stress for families. It's not going to help with access arrangements and things like that. Obviously, panic and concern about what's going to happen to families. A lot of people will want to be leaving Hong Kong because of it.
Now, what advice do you have for families with young children who are afraid of being separated from their parents? What advice do you have for families with young children who are afraid of being separated from if they are positive or close contacts? Where can they go for help?
Well, you said, go for help. Again, the rules changing all the time, so it's very difficult to say what can be done because there's no certainty right now. If you listen to the press conferences, the rules change all the time, and as I said, the hospital authority is overwhelmed right now. No one wants to take the children away from families. That's not the intention. So, families have to hold on. They have to try and be reassured that no one's trying to take their children away from them.
So your plea to the government would basically be to have just clearer guidelines?
Yes, absolutely.
Now, the government has had a number of different COVID hotlines to advise people. Why do you think so many, have any of them expressed kind of told you about their experiences of these hotlines, and have they been helpful at all?
No, I haven't. I don't know about the hotlines.
Okay, and so I guess it's kind of telling that so many people are seeking help from you instead of a government hotline, I guess.
Well, it's more about talking about keeping their families together, as they assisting with drawing up guardianship documents. They want to know they've got something in place in the unfortunate event something happens to them. They want to have something just in place. They hope they never want to use them, but they want something that gives them peace of mind.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us this morning. That was lawyer Samantha Gershon, a partner with his family team.
It's now 14 minutes to 8 on Hong Kong today. The government has gazetted emergency laws that allow mainland people to work in the SAR without needing to get licensed or registered here. Damon Pang reports.
Authorities said the emergency laws, which also say construction projects won't need to go through the statutory process, will provide a legal basis for it to implement anti-epidemic measures supported by Beijing, including the construction of hospitals and isolation facilities. In a statement, the government said Hong Kong's in a very dire COVID situation. It added the healthcare system and manpower will be unable to cope with the surging number of patients soon. This constitutes emergency and public danger, it said.
The Financial Secretary, Paul Chan, says landlords should still be able to take action to try to recover any rent owed by their tenants from last year. He was speaking in a radio phone-in programme on his budget, which he unveiled on Wednesday. In his budget, he'd announced a moratorium on landlords evicting tenants who were in arrears or starting legal proceedings against them during the current surge in the pandemic. Violet Wong reports.
They have been lagging behind on the rent for more than a year. Even though they paid a deposit amounting to 3 months' rent, that would not be enough to cover the outstanding amount of rent.
That was the complaint from one of the landlords who voiced their opinions on the joint radio show. In response, Paul Chan said the authorities plan to allow property owners to settle such issues according to the terms of their contracts.
Our preliminary idea is to draw a line on January the 1st when the COVID outbreak began. We hope landlords will go easy on tenants falling behind on their rent since this date and talk with them about the arrangement. This wave of outbreak came too rapidly. Can they try to find a way out together? The amount of outstanding rent before, meanwhile, can be handled according to their contracts.
Mr. Chan also offered reassurance to landlords who are worried about being unable to meet their mortgage commitments, saying the Monetary Authority will tell banks to be flexible in handling such cases. But another caller, Mr. Mack, was not assuaged.
You're legislating for tenants to be able to pay rent at a later date. But unfortunately, you're not making a law to ban banks from collecting mortgage payments from me. So where do I get the money to pay the bank? You said you hope the banks will be understanding. But will they really be? I don't know banks that are considerate to those who don't make repayments on time.
The tenant eviction ban, proposed in the budget, will last 3 months with a 3-month extension if necessary. But only select SMEs will be protected tenants, chiefly retailers and other businesses hard hit by anti-pandemic measures. The Financial Secretary said the administration will seek quick approval of the measure by the Executive and Legislative Councils, so it can take effect as soon as possible. Election Committee lawmaker Nelson Lam said he backs Mr. Chan's proposal, but he told RTHK that property developers should do more to help struggling businesses.
Violet Wong reporting there. Well, the Financial Secretary, Paul Chan, will be coming to Radio 3 studios this morning from 8 a.m. to 9 o'clock to take part in our phone-in programme. You can call 233-88266 if you want to take part.
Stock markets around the world fell sharply at first following the Russian invasion, but the Dow Jones in New York closed in positive territory. Shares indexes in London, Frankfurt and Paris all closed nearly 4% down. The price of natural gas in Europe has shot up by more than a third. Europe relies on Russia for oil and gas, with 40% of gas supplies flowing through Ukrainian territory. Oil prices hit their highest level in 7 years, surging past $100 a barrel. The main stock index in Russia closed down almost 16%. The Russian ruble earlier fell to an all-time low against the dollar. It's bounced back slightly. Ed Weir is a senior market analyst with Oanda, a global currency exchange trading corporation.
Well, I think President Putin was well aware that this was the path that was going to be taken by the G7. And right now, you're probably going to see that there is going to be further market pain. The Russian stock market lost over $200 billion. And you're going to see that Russia was prepared. They are expecting that this is going to be the path that the U.S. and Europeans are going to be taking. And there's probably going to be accelerated actions taken throughout the coming weeks and months. But I think that right now this is going to really rattle Russian markets. And I think you're probably going to see that their central banks are going to continue to take emergency steps. But this is a difficult environment for them.
Now time for a look at some other business and finance headlines. Yesterday, Asian equities plunged with Hong Kong, Sydney, Mumbai, Singapore and Wellington down at least 3%, while Seoul, Taipei, Bangkok and Manila fell more than 2%. There were also steep losses in Tokyo, Shanghai and Jakarta. The Hang Seng Index closed 758 points lower at 22,901. Despite that, Ken Wong from East Spring Investments told RTHK he's cautiously optimistic about the markets a month from now.
There just seems to be quite a bit of uneasiness in regards to either geopolitical tensions or then sort of other potential, sort of maybe regulations, and crackdowns in China. But the fact is that I think right now the markets are treading on a very sort of thin line in that sense, where they're uncertain in terms of the direction. Everyone's waiting for March to come because companies start to report their earnings. We're gradually starting to see that now. So I think a lot of investors are really waiting to see, especially here in Hong Kong and also for Chinese companies as well, to see kind of what guidance will be for 2022 and beyond. But the fact is that, I also looked at some analysis and looking at some of the previous military escalations that we've seen over the past couple of decades. We've gone through Afghanistan, right? We've gone through Iraq and even more recently with Russia and Crimea. The fact is that a month after the escalation took place, the markets actually were positive in all these scenarios. So
private home prices have fallen for the fourth month in a row to their lowest level since March. New government indices show private flat prices in January fell 1.1% month on month, but on year prices were still 1.8% higher. Hannah Zhong, the head of valuation at real estate services company Colliers Hong Kong, said the prices could go down further if the COVID outbreak here wasn't brought under control. She spoke to Violet Wong.
I think at this moment, the Omicron situation is serious than what we expected, and the situation is getting worse. So it has been giving a lot of pressure to some of the homeowners, or they're thinking about, Hong Kong may not be the safer place that they want to move out, or they want to reserve some cash. So there are some urgent sales in the market, and that has been causing the price fall at this moment.
And it's now 6 minutes to 8, and the sports is coming up next.
To contain COVID-19, the government collects sewage samples in various districts for testing. For positive samples, rapid test kits are given to concerned residents for self-testing. The public should watch the demo and follow the kit's instructions. Waiting time for the results must be 20 minutes. Those tested positive should arrange further tests without delay. Rapid test kits are for voluntary tests. They are not a substitute for compulsory testing. Together, we fight the virus.
Time for our last look at sports. I'm Adam Zhang. We start in the English Premier League, where Arsenal boosted their hopes of finishing in the top four with a come-from-behind 2-1 win over Wolves at the Emirates. The Gunners fell behind to Hwan Hee-chan's early goal but fought back in the second half. Nicolas Pepe came off the bench to equalize in the 82nd minute. Then in the final seconds, Wolves keeper José Sá deflected a shot by Alexander Lacazette into his own net. Arsenal's third successive league victory moved them up to 5th in the table. Manager Mikel Arteta says a dramatic win like this can bring a team together.
It creates such a belief and togetherness and an atmosphere and cohesion with our fans as well, and that's extremely necessary. We really want to create something special here, and without our fans we're not going to be able to do it. And this team needs that belief. We are a really young squad, and I just say at half-time we want to be there, third, fourth in the top with those big teams. We have to be able to go out there in the second half and beat them. And that was the spirit right from the beginning at halftime, and they managed to do it.
Arsenal are just 1 point behind 4th place Manchester United and have 2 games in hand in the race to qualify for the Champions League. The Gunners have recorded 14 Premier League wins from September onwards. Only Manchester City and Liverpool have done better. In the Europa League, Barcelona cruised into the last 16 after a comfortable 4-2 win over Napoli. The Catalans go through 5-3 on aggregate. Sevilla also progressed with a 3-2 aggregate success despite dropping the second leg 1-0 to Dinamo Zagreb. Real Betis advanced 3-2 on aggregate after a goalless second leg against Zenit St. Petersburg. Atalanta completed a 5-1 aggregate win over Olympiacos, but Lazio are out. They drew 2-2 with Porto, with the Portuguese side progressing 4-3 over 2 legs. Leicester City are into the last 16 of the Europa Conference League. They finished off the Danish side Renders 3-1 for a 7-2 aggregate win. James Maddison scored twice in the second half. The Leicester midfielder was pleased to see the way his side defended, even when they had a big lead.
Job done, really. Seven goals over the 2 legs. We had to defend the box quite a lot tonight, a lot of almost like goalmouth scrambles and lads putting the blocks on the line, even when we were 7-1 up on aggregate, I think it was. See AnneMarie throwing himself in front of the ball, Casper last-ditch blocks. We actually made it, I think it was Dan who made a last-ditch block, and 7-1 up on aggregate. Casper runs out, really happy to thank him, congratulate him on the block, because that's what it meant to keep a clean sheet. So it was really nice to see that, really refreshing.
The Scottish side Celtic crashed out of the Conference League after losing 2-0 away to Bodo Glimt. It finished 5-1 over 2 legs in favour of the Norwegians. On the ice, the NHL leading Colorado Avalanche brushed aside the Detroit Red Wings 5-2 to go 12 points clear above everyone else in the Western Conference. Also in the West, the Calgary Flames ride a 10-game winning streak into Vancouver to face the Canucks later today. Our U.S. sports commentator Ray Jovanovich says Colorado and Florida are the teams to watch out for.
The Colorado Avalanche are the NHL's best team by far, 78 points. They've got a goal differential of 59. They've scored over 200 goals this season. The other team that's done virtually the same has been the team leading the Eastern Conference, the Florida Panthers. They've got 212 goals, and they've got a goal differential of 61. Both these 2 teams really showing why they're the top in the NHL. But as you mentioned, the Calgary Flames have been on fire. They've come out of nowhere to win those 10 consecutive games to get the first place in the Pacific Division.
Staying with the NHL, veteran forward Corey Perry has reached a personal milestone. He's become the 103rd player in league history to reach 400 goals when he scored on the power play for the Tampa Bay Lightning against the Edmonton Oilers. The Lightning took this one 5-3. They're 3 points behind the Atlantic Division leading Florida Panthers. And that's your look at sports.
Thanks, Adam. Before we go today, the weather forecast. Cold in the morning, mainly fine later with a top temperature of around 18 degrees. The very cold weather warning is currently in force. Winds moderate north to northeasterlies. Right now it's 13 degrees, relative humidity 75%.
The mainland and Hong Kong are connected. We all do our best with what we have to achieve a bright future together.
RTHK News.
The 8 o'clock news with Andrew Shirovsky. President Biden is to impose sanctions on a key Baltic gas pipeline, Nordstream 2, as he toughens measures against Russia over its stance on Ukraine. The sanctions will target the company and its corporate officers. It follows a decision on Tuesday by Germany to suspend the certification process for the recently completed pipeline. A State Department spokesman, Ned Price, praised the unity of NATO countries.
Russia shows signs of readiness to further escalate its aggression against Ukraine, and we have limited time to stop, deter, and contain it. Every hour of inaction now is a threat to the lives of Ukrainians. This is an escalating threat to our collective global security and to our freedom. Ukraine expects decisive, immediate, and proportional actions by the international community.
In local news, health authorities have been notified of 17,269 new COVID infections, which includes all the cases collected from public and private labs in the past day and covers both preliminary positive and confirmed cases. Another 50 COVID patients have passed away in the past day. Officials said a 9-year-old boy who was chronically ill passed away after he was found unconscious at home. The child tested positive for COVID when he was sent to the United Christian Hospital. Lau Ka-hin is the chief manager of the hospital authority.
The parents told us that the patient has some tiredness, malaise, and decrease in appetite, but there was no other upper respiratory tract infection symptoms, no fever, no convulsion, and the patient was not tested any COVID before the admission.
You're listening to the news on RTHK.